On the night of February 3, 1972, a triple homicide occurred on Clyde Townsend Road in Boone, North Carolina during a heavy snowstorm. The case would become known locally as the Durham case and would go unsolved for the next 50 years. The victims were 51-year-old Bryce Durham, his 44-year-old wife, Virginia, and their 18-year-old son, Bobby Durham. Virginia called her son-in-law Troy Hall in a panic and said that some men were holding her husband and son captive in the house. Troy at first thought it was a joke, but then the phone disconnected. Troy and his wife, Jeannie, the Durham's daughter, went to check on the family, but their car wouldn't start. So a neighbor, Cecil Small, agreed to drive them. The road up to the Durham's house was too treacherous to travel by car, so Troy and Cecil went alone while Jeannie Sue waited in the car. They discovered the family had just been murdered and were most likely only a couple minutes shot at encountering the killers on the way to the house. Troy called the sheriff's office from a neighbor's apartment at 10:50 p.m. to report the crime. When officers arrived and started investigating the crime scene, they noticed the victims must have been interrupted while eating dinner as they found a half-eaten baked chicken on the kitchen table. A money bag stuffed with $100 bills remained untouched and nothing appeared to have been taken. But there was a messy scene. Investigators were told that a green and white SUV was seen leaving the Durham's house just after 10:30 p.m. The North Carolina Highway Patrol found it several hours later on the side of the road a few miles away with its lights, windshield wipers, and motor still on. Bryce had taken the car from his dealership to get home in the snowstorm, and the killers used it as their getaway vehicle and had left a bag of silver behind in it. Bryce owned a Buick dealership in Boone in the Blue Ridge Mountains near the Tennessee border, where Virginia kept the books, and their son Bobby was in his first year of school at Appalachian State University. The family was described as hardworking, quiet, and mostly kept to themselves, and investigators could not determine who would want them dead. A lack of evidence led to many theories as to who the culprits might be, from ringleaders of a car dealership scam in a neighboring county to Green Berets in town for a ski demonstration at the nearby ski resorts. In May 2019, nearly 5 decades later, the sheriff's office in Watauga County, North Carolina, received a phone call from the White County Sheriff's Office in Georgia, 200 miles away, with a tip in the case. Shane Burt, the son of Billy Sunday Burt of the Dixie Mafia, had visited the sheriff's office to participate in research for a book about notorious crimes in the state. He said he was very close with his father and recalled a story that Burt told him during a visit with him in prison. He said his father admitted to killing 3 people in the North Carolina mountains during a heavy snowstorm and mentioned how they almost got caught. With the new information in hand, authorities began to investigate the new leads. They also conducted in-person interviews with Billy Wayne Davis in September 2019, October 2020, and August 2021. Those interviews were what ultimately helped determine who was responsible for the murders in 1972. 2 sources were able to corroborate the evidence from the Durham case crime scene. The circumstances of the crime were very similar to a 1973 case in Georgia known as the Fleming case, in which Billy Burt, Bobby Gaddis, Charles Reed, and Billy Davis were all involved. These 4 men were leaders of the Georgia-based Dixie Mafia who engaged in dozens of violent crimes in Georgia and Mississippi and other southern states across the Southeast in the 1960s and 70s. They robbed many banks and gambling houses, hauled lot of whiskey and pills from state to state, burglarized up to 4 homes a night at times, and took many lives. During those interviews, Davis implicated Burt, Gaddis, and Reed for engaging in a hired hit in the North Carolina mountains that occurred during a bad snowstorm. Davis claimed to have acted only as their getaway driver, and that it was the other 3 men that entered the house that night, but many speculate his involvement was much more. It still remains unclear who solicited the crime against the Durham family. 81-year-old Davis is currently serving life for a murder in 1971, one of many murders he committed, and is the only one of the 4 men that is still alive. Burt died in prison in 2017 while serving life for 3 murders he committed in the 1970s. Jenny and other surviving family members were thankful to receive the news in November 2021 and to finally have some closure. Alicia Masidi was born November 8, 1991. At the age of 13, her mother Roberta was deemed an unfit parent who struggled with depression. Roberta lost custody of her children when she could not afford an attorney during her legal battle. So Alicia and her brother were sent by a Santa Clara County judge to live with their father Mark Masidi in Ceres, California. Shockingly, the court gave him custody despite the fact that Masidi had a long criminal record with state and federal charges, including domestic violence, drunk driving, and bank fraud. Less than a year later, he would take his daughter's life in a horrifying way. On August 14, 2006, Mark's girlfriend Shelley took a flight from Los Angeles to Northern California to visit Mark at his home in Ceres. Shelley originally planned to pick 14-year-old Alicia up from a relative's house in San Jose on her way home from the airport, but Mark called her and told her to come straight to Ceres instead. When Shelley questioned where Alicia was, Mark allegedly told her that she had run away. Shelley later reported her missing as a runaway to the Ceres Police Department. At first, investigators stated that they did not find any evidence of foul play, and they believed Alicia actually had run away from home and took her pet chihuahua with her. Mark told police that Alicia called home a couple days later and said she had gone camping with friends and refused to disclose her location. He would then periodically tell police that she would check in with him but not telling him where she was, and he stuck to this story for 3 years. He ended up being evicted from the rental home a few months after Alicia went missing and eventually moved to Los Angeles with Shelley. Her mother told police that she didn't believe her daughter ran away and suspected foul play. Roberta reported that her ex-husband failed to enroll the children in school and remain in touch with her. 3 years later, after she went missing on March 25, 2009, investigators brought cadaver dogs to Mark's old home in Ceres. After getting a hit, a team dug up the backyard of his former rental home and ended up finding remains just feet from the edge of the patio. The remains would be identified as those of Alicia Masidi. Investigators then obtained a search warrant for the home Mark and Shelley shared in Los Angeles. There, it was discovered that Mark and Shelley were running a meth lab in the home where children were living. The two were subsequently arrested and booked on drug and child endangerment charges. Upon his arrest, they also recovered several computers, hard drives, DVDs, CDs, and other digital media. The case took ages to come to trial, first because he had to be prosecuted in Los Angeles County for running a meth lab there. Then the trial drug out because he opted to act as his own attorney, then changed his mind and again changed his mind regarding his plea. He purposely tried to delay the process, which was very upsetting to Alicia's family. As these charges were pending in Los Angeles, investigators in Ceres began working with Stanislaus County prosecutors on Alicia's case. An autopsy concluded that Alicia died of acute drug intoxication by a cocktail of 8 extremely powerful drugs. Investigators believed that Mark provided his daughter with these drugs to prevent her from resisting his sexual abuse, which he later admitted to. Mark was found in possession of photos that prove the abuse against Alicia. He was then charged with her murder, the abuse against her, and in addition, he was charged with abuse against 2 other minors, which occurred after his daughter's death. His girlfriend's 8-year-old daughter and a 16-year-old who left the state out of fear of him before he was arrested. Mark's death penalty trial began in October 2017, but about 2 weeks in, he decided to plead guilty to 49 heinous crimes, including all the sexual abuse and drugs. He did this to attempt to dodge the death penalty in lieu of a life prison sentence without the possibility of parole. His defense attorney, Martin Baker, argued that Alicia's diary suggested she was a drug addict, with her writing in one passage that she wanted to feel nothing. 6 weeks after jury selection, Mark decided he wanted to take his guilty plea back, which caused the trial to be postponed. But ultimately, the judge denied this, and Mark was eventually sentenced to life behind bars an entire decade after her remains were found. Maurice and Chivarella was born November 25, 1954 to Mary and Carmen Chivarella, and had 3 brothers and a sister. At the age of 9, she lived in Hazel Township, Pennsylvania, but was killed on March 18, 1964, while taking canned goods to a church on her way to school in Hazleton. She normally walked the short half-mile journey to her school with her siblings, but left early this day to get the canned goods to a nun at a local church. Maurice loved the church and had dreams of becoming a nun before her life was sadly taken. Her body was found the same day, more than 2 miles away at a strip mining pit north of Route 309 in Hazel Township, adjacent to the Hazleton Airport. She had suffered a tragic physical and sexual assault. The canned goods she had with her were found strewn near her body. Sadly, the case would go cold for nearly 58 years. A few years ago, a snapshot phenotype of the suspect's face was produced by Parabon Nanolabs based on the suspect's DNA. Several images of the killer were created that represented what he would look like at the ages of 25, 50, and 60 years old. The Pennsylvania State Police DNA lab was able to develop a suspect profile based on a DNA sample left on Marissa's jacket. They checked the DNA against all previous suspects and none matched, so they were all ruled out as being her killer. In 2007, the sample was then uploaded to a DNA database and checked monthly against new DNA. In 2018, it was decided to try genetic genealogy. By 2020, Eric Schubert, a college student and expert in genetic genealogy who had volunteered to work the case, put together an extensive family tree after establishing a very distant cousin of the suspect. This helped investigators narrow their suspect list, which finally led to her murderer, James Paul Fort. In January 2022, police exhumed his body to collect a sample of his DNA, which matched the DNA found on Morris's jacket at the crime scene. Fort was 22 at the time of the murder and had no known connection to Maurice or her family. Fort died in May 1980 at the age of 38 from natural causes, possibly a heart attack according to police. He had different addresses over the years, but he lived within 6 blocks of where Maurice was last seen the day she was killed. He was a bartender and was also charged with another violent sexual assault against a woman years after Marissa's death, but thankfully that victim survived. A press conference was scheduled for February 10, 2022. It was packed with active and retired police officers who had worked on Marissa's case, including the state trooper who first investigated the killing. Marissa's 4 siblings were also present, along with Trooper Mark Barron, who was the case's lead investigator. This is the oldest case to be solved in Pennsylvania and the 4th oldest to be solved in the country using genetic genealogy. And you can bet your ass there will be more. And I hope these evil bastards are in a constant state of fear now. 57-year-old Kimberly Carter Flint of Laneville, Texas, who went missing. She had been battling depression and strangely vanished following a one-vehicle crash on the Angelina River Bridge about 15 miles from her home on September 26, 2018. She didn't like to drive and rarely left home and had asked her husband to bring home dinner. Strangely, the crash happened just 45 minutes after she last spoke to her husband on the phone. Her family was confused as to why she up and left home at all. She was not found in the vehicle, and many nearby searches turned up no clues to her whereabouts. There was also no signs of injury in the vehicle, and the airbags did not deploy, which is most likely due to the angle that she hit the bridge, even though she was traveling at 83 miles per hour. It was unclear if she set out to harm herself or met with foul play. However, 4 years later, in January 2022, her remains were located in a wooded area on property near Ritchie Lane in Reclaw, Texas, which is about a mile from where her vehicle was located. The area is described as rough terrain and very hard to navigate. Drones, search dogs, and equipment such as all-terrain vehicles were previously used to search the area but found nothing at the time. Once the remains were discovered, they were taken to the University of North Texas Center for Human Identification for DNA testing and dental recognition. Her husband of 40 years, James Flint, passed away in August 2021, just months before his wife's remains were located. Although her remains were located, her cause of death has not been released to the public, but there are still reportedly no signs of foul play. Her family now hopefully has some type of closure and was happy to finally lay her to rest. Sarah Louise Yarborough was born on June 12, 1975 to Tom and Laura Yarborough in Portland, Oregon. At some point, her family would move to Federal Way, Washington, near her grandparents. As a sophomore, Sarah was an honors student and a member of the drill team. She loved art, ballet, and her friends. She was an excellent student who had already been to New Zealand twice for an educational outreach program. She was known to always have a book in her hand and was looking forward to college. On the morning of Saturday, December 14, 1991, tragedy would strike and her life would sadly be taken away by a monster. Sarah and her drill team were meeting up first thing in the morning at school to get on a bus that would take them to an event where they were supposed to perform. Sarah thought bus time was 8 to 8:30, but it was actually 9 to 9:30. So when she pulled into the school's back parking lot at 8:15 a.m., she was 45 minutes early. No one else was in the lot at the time, but there were a lot of people at the high school for various activities. At some point after she arrived, a jogger passing on a trail near the sports field noticed a man and a woman lying in the tall grass nearby. The jogger assumed it was a couple making out and continued jogging. He would pass them once more, but again, kept to his own business and jogged back to the parking lot. Minutes later, two 12-year-old boys were approaching the area and saw a man walking towards them out of the brush. When he looked up and noticed the boys, he quickly turned away from them and went another direction. They thought the guy was acting strange and continued walking in that direction and would eventually discover Sarah's body. They panicked and ran home to tell their parents. One of the boys' dads went to search for the Chevy Nova. The kids said they thought the killer drove away in. The dad stopped at a nearby store parking lot and told someone to call police. Once he got back out to his car, he'd completely lost track of the Chevy. It was determined that she had been fatally attacked, but they were able to preserve DNA from the killer. When word began to spread about what had happened, tips began to pour in. The jogger and the boys described the man they saw as a white man in his 20s, about 6 foot tall, with shoulder-length blonde hair. He was wearing a dark trench coat and dark pants. When the Chevy Nova was tracked down and ended up being a guy that had pulled into the parking lot to eat breakfast. Even after his explanation, he was still investigated, but DNA would eventually rule him out. There were so many tips piling into police that they were having a hard time keeping up, and it was actually slowing them down. So Sarah's grandfather, John Holmquist, a scientist at Weyerhaeuser Company, got permission from his employment to loan the police department a $150,000 computer to help them collect, organize, and analyze all the tips law enforcement was receiving. Sarah would have graduated with her class in June of 1993. Her class raised $40,000 and a local sculptor created a bench dedicated to her. The bench was placed in front of Federal Way High School just 3 days before her class graduated. A replica of her belongings and of her beloved dog stands on the ground with his front paws up on the bench as if sniffing out Sarah's scent from her possessions. In 2011, the detective on the case reached out to genealogy research company, Identifinders International. He asked them if they could perform a genealogy report on the suspect's DNA. Despite forensic genetic genealogy just beginning to grow, Colleen Fitzpatrick was still able to come to the conclusion that Sarah's killer was one of the decedents of Robert Fuller, who came from England to America on the Mayflower in 1638 at the age of 23. The investigator took this information and began to look for people with the surname Fuller in and around King County in 1991. He found a few Fullers and brought some pictures of them to the child witnesses from 20 years ago. But the boys who were over 30 by then didn't recognize any of the men from that morning in 1991. The investigator interviewed a few of the Fuller men in the area anyway and asked for their DNA samples, in which they agreed to provide. These samples were sent to the state crime lab and compared to the suspect's DNA. None of them were an exact match, but one man was actually determined to be a distant relative of the suspect. They shared enough DNA to be genetically linked on their father's sides. Fitzpatrick of Identifinders International knew they were cousins in some way, but didn't know how distant of cousins they were. After that, because of the limits in the field at the time, Identifinders' involvement in the case ended. Amazingly, this case helped in the development of forensic genetic genealogy as we know it today. In 2017, the detective reached out again to Identifinders, and they agreed to work further on the case using advancements that occurred over the past several years. After 27 years of police investigating thousands of tips and leads and swabbing 200 to 300 possible suspects, they finally had a possible match. On September 27, 2019, Fitzpatrick called the detective with names to look into as a possible owner of the DNA found on Sarah's clothes almost 28 years ago. They had zeroed in on two brothers, one born in 1958 and one born in 1964. Despite the older brother being a registered sex offender who had served time, his DNA was in Cody's and had never matched as a hit, so he was ruled out. The younger brother also had a history of sex-related crimes and lived in and around King County when Sarah was killed. Police began surveilling him and soon followed him to the laundromat, Lake Meridian Cleaners, near his home in Kent, Washington. While his clothes were laundering, he stepped outside to smoke a cigarette. Once done, he threw it on the ground and detectives confiscated the cigarette as evidence. But they decided to stay longer and was able to snatch another cigarette and a napkin that fell out of his pocket that he didn't bother picking up. During the surveillance at the laundromat, one of the detectives approached the suspect and asked him for directions. He learned that he goes by Leon, which is actually the suspect's middle name, not his first name. The evidence was sent to the crime lab for testing and a match was made. The next day, October 3, 2019, the King County Sheriff's Department announced the arrest of Patrick Leon Nicholas for the 1991 murder of 16-year-old Sarah Yarborough. Nicholas was born in 1964 and at the time of his arrest, he was living in Covington, Washington, just 12 miles from Federal Way High School. He had never been investigated in the murder case. One night in 1983, he had kidnapped a girl in her own car, and when he tried to get her out of the car, she was able to escape by jumping in the river and swimming downstream. Nicholas then bought a plane ticket and flew out of state, but police caught him and he served 3 or 4 years behind bars. Then in 1994, he pleaded guilty to a gross misdemeanor assault in the 4th degree of a minor. Washington State had instituted a policy to collect DNA from its criminal offenders in 1990, but the gross misdemeanor conviction was not a high enough charge that would require him to submit his DNA. This may be why he pleaded guilty to avoid risking a higher charge and having his DNA placed into Cody's. Since his biological grandfather had been adopted, it had made the genetic genealogy harder to navigate. He was arrested and given a $5 million bail, but pleaded not guilty to the murder. Thankfully, Sarah's family finally has some closure. On May 25, 2003, a hiker's dog discovered a skull on a slope 1,000 feet above the ski resort Mammoth Lakes in California. Days later, more remains were found at the top of a ridge called Mammoth Knolls near Shady Rest Park. The San Francisco Medical Examiner's Office determined that the victim had been killed around the fall of 2002, less than a year earlier. Was later determined to be the remains of a female between the ages of 30 and 40 years old. Her teeth were in poor condition and she had likely received little to no dental care during her life. It was also discovered that she had given birth at least once in her life. For the first time in criminal investigation history, forensic isotope testing was performed on the remains in a Canadian lab to estimate the locations where the victim spent time in based on the water she drank. This paired with the DNA testing revealed that she was likely born and raised as a child in Southern California or Northern Mexico and had later moved to Southern Mexico or Oaxaca where she lived for about a decade. Her diet was described as very poor and she had consumed a significant amount of corn. Unable to determine her identity, she became known as Mammoth Lakes Jane Doe. Detective Paul Dostie of the Mammoth Lakes Police Department led the investigation. He contacted Dr. Philip Walker, a physical anthropologist at the UCSB, and an expert in prehistoric Native Americans to help him on the case. Dr. Walker believed that the San Francisco Medical Examiner had performed an inadequate autopsy because there was no official cause of death. It's presumed that snow covering the burial site prevented an earlier discovery. Mitochondrial DNA testing was performed of the victim, which showed that she was of Zapotec Indian descent from the Oaxaca village. Investigators traveled to this location twice, looking for answers to her identity, but were unsuccessful. However, days after the discovery, a park ranger working at the Mammoth Lakes Visitor Center came forward to state that he recalled a woman who had visited the area in the fall of 2002 with a man, possibly her husband. He said she was a very petite woman, possibly Asian, and she appeared afraid of the man she was with, who was heavyset and had a bushy mustache. At one point, she had told a park ranger that he was abusive towards her and wouldn't let her go. She was then given a Wild Iris Domestic Violence Services card. Her husband asked questions about the regulations of the campground and how long visitors were allowed to stay. He was described as abrasive and mean-spirited. From the descriptions, they were able to create composite sketches of the couple. The victim's face was reconstructed by Betty Pat Gatliff, a noted Oklahoma forensic artist who specializes in 3D facial reconstructions. The photograph was printed on flyers that were distributed throughout the Oaxaca community in Los Angeles. Also, Ray Morales, president of the Oaxacan Businessmen's Association, distributed the flyers in the area. In 2006, the woman on the flyer was falsely identified as Barbara Pacheco Santiago by her stepmother who had not seen her for over 7 years. Santiago's biological parents have been dead for many years, and her stepmother said Pacheco Santiago had 2 sons, neither of whom have been located. It would be years before this false identification was corrected. 18 years later, on August 31, 2021, using DNA advancement, her identity was finally determined to be 30-year-old Isabel Sanchez Bernal. Her suspected killer was also announced as Diego Santiago Hernandez Antonia, and he was arrested for her murder. Isabel was from Pueblo, Mexico, but had been living in California for about 2 years prior to her death. Hernandez Antonia is a local from the town of Mammoth Lakes where Isabel's body was found. It is unclear what his relationship was to her, and police are asking anyone who knows the couple to come forward. But as of now, Isabel has her name back and her killer remains behind bars. On May 13, 1988, a man mowing with a tractor discovered a body in St. Lucie County, Florida off Route 70. The body was found under a grapefruit tree in a grove area west of McCarty Road and south of Okeechobee Road. Also found nearby were 3 20-gauge shotgun shells. The body belonged to an unidentified man who was found wearing a wedding ring. 3 bullet wounds were found that resulted in his death. Investigators met with a witness 11 days after the discovery of the body. He stated that the remains probably belonged to 25-year-old Rocky Lane Taylor of Alabama. He said that he had been friends with Rocky and Michael Lewis Akins, and they had lived with him in his trailer at the 3900 block of South Hector Canal Road in Fort Pierce, Florida, for 4 weeks. He stated that Rocky and Michael had been in a tumultuous and toxic relationship consisting of physical and verbal fights. He said that Michael often accused Rocky of being an alcoholic hustler and using people for money. Rocky was often angry at Michael for acting in a feminine manner while they were in public. Michael allegedly stated that he was fed up with Rocky using him. Rocky had also conned others by marrying a 52-year-old woman and 2 other women long enough to spend their money. The man said in December 1987, Michael shot Rocky with a .25 caliber pistol during an altercation. Hospital records showed Rocky was brought in with a superficial gunshot wound, but left before being treated. The man said he had made Michael and Rocky move out around April 1st, 1988 because of the alcohol and constant fighting, but they returned weeks later asking to move back in, but he wouldn't allow it. He said their fights often resulted in injuries and Michael often threatened to kill Rocky. In May of 1988, Michael returned to the trailer and tried to sell him a shotgun. When asked where Rocky was, Michael allegedly stated that he was gone for good and would never be able to bother him anymore, claiming he had shot him. In June of 1988, investigators spoke with Michael at his parents' home in Okeechobee County. When they told him about the homicide, he began screaming and became very uncooperative and even became abusive when his mother came out of the house and came to his side. A later interview with him was described as basically fruitless, with Michael just wanting to talk about his love for Rocky. He said they took long walks in the area where Rocky's body was found and agreed that they often got in violent arguments but always made up. Despite these claims, no arrest was made and Rocky's identity would go undetermined for the next 33 years, mostly because his friends were unable to identify the clothing on his body as belonging to him. Investigators at the time had a strong idea Michael was responsible, but prosecutors denied a warrant because the medical examiner's office couldn't make the identification. Over 30 years later, an investigator tracked down 2 of Rocky's brothers, one in Texas and one in Alabama. They agreed to DNA testing to find out if the remains indeed belonged to their brother Rocky. In 2021, after a long delay due to COVID-19, the results finally came back indicating the remains were in fact Rocky Lane Taylor. Weeks later, the match was publicized and according to police, there is sufficient evidence to make an arrest. However, the agency's cold case detective closed the case against Michael because he passed away with cancer in 2015. 33 years to the day, Rocky's surviving family members had a celebration of life for Rocky in their home state of Alabama. Around 1960, Jerry Barnett was born to Anna Mary Barnett, who was a teenager at the time. Her family members often helped care for Jerry while she worked, but one day Anna Mary left him with a babysitter that she didn't know very well. On that day in 1965, she returned to pick up 5-year-old Jerry from the babysitter, but was shocked to discover that she had moved and taken Jerry with her. The babysitter allegedly took him to Delaware and then later abandoned him. He would then become a ward of the state and placed into the foster care system. He was given the last name Thomas and an estimated date of birth because there were no records on him or his family available to the foster care system. Several years ago, Damon Parker, Jerry's son, took a DNA test for a genealogy website and matched with a cousin named Will Barnett in Kentucky. The two connected and Damon learned of his father's history. In 2020, Damon and his father Jerry drove from Delaware to Kentucky where Jerry would reunite with his mother after 55 years. They had a joyous reunion with many family members and she showed her son his birth certificate. Anna Mary stated she had reached out for help from agencies to locate Jerry, but this was during the civil rights movement and some agencies even sadly turned her away. To this day, the family is continuing to make up for all the years of lost time. In January 2022, it was announced that police in Colorado had solved the murders of 3 women and a teenage girl by using familial DNA and genetic genealogy. The victims were 53-year-old Dolores Brajas, 33-year-old Madeline Livaday, 27-year-old Gwendolyn Harris, and 17-year-old Antoinette Parks, and were all killed between 1978 and 1981 in the Denver, Colorado area. Initially, investigators were working on each cold case separately, but between 2013 and 2018, these 4 cases were linked together by DNA evidence. They were all linked to one possible suspect, Joe Michael Irvin. In 2019, the Denver Police Crime Laboratory learned of an ancestry link in Texas to the suspect. The link was discovered while doing a search in Texas records for biological relatives of the killer's DNA profile. Then in 2021, authorities exhumed Irvin's body from an Arlington cemetery and used DNA to confirm he had, in fact, killed the 4 females. The killing stopped in June of 1981 when Deborah Sue Core, an Aurora police officer, pulled Irvin over in a traffic stop in what was the first line of duty death for the Aurora Police Department. He also wounded bystander Glenn Spies when Spies witnessed the incident and tried to intervene. He would take his own life 4 days later while in custody for her murder. Irvin's criminal history began in October of 1969 when he was indicted for the August 8, 1969 murder of 21-year-old Rodney Jean Bonham at the since-demolished Berry Bowl off East Berry Street in Fort Worth, Texas. Colorado police did not connect Irvin to the Texas arrest warrant because his birth year had been entered incorrectly into NCIC, and also because he had adopted the surname Irwing instead of Irvin after fleeing to Colorado. Those mistakes would cost the lives of multiple women. Dolores Barajas was killed when she was a 53-year-old wife, mother, and grandmother. She was fatally attacked while walking to work. She was visiting family in Denver that summer and working at a hotel downtown. The Sunday she was killed was supposed to be her last day of work before she returned home. On August 10, 1980, after her death, her body was found lying in the street on the 500 block of East 17th Avenue. Police have not released a photo of Dolores at her family's request. In January of 1981, Irvin allegedly killed a 17-year-old girl named Antoinette Parks. On January 24, 1981, Adams County deputies found her body in a field near 64th Avenue and Broadway. She had also been fatally attacked. She loved music and her family described her as caring, determined, and loved children. Madeline Livaday grew up in Central Florida, one of 5 sisters, and was an avid swimmer. She attended high school in Florida and graduated from Tulane University. Prior to getting married, she led an adventurous life traveling to Africa and Europe as part of her work as an editor on the beloved children's magazine, Ranger Rick. Madeline was the first victim killed on December 7, 1978, when she was a 33-year-old mother of 2. An unknown man came to her door on Poplar Street in Denver, while she was cooking breakfast for her children and fatally attacked her. Gwendolyn Harris was found fatally attacked when she was a 27-year-old mother. She was last seen at a lounge in downtown Denver about a block away from Irvin's residence. Her family described her as a bright, soft-spoken, and athletic woman. On December 21, 1980, after her death, her body was found near East 47th Avenue and Andrews Drive in Denver's Montbello neighborhood. Madeline's daughters and the brothers of Antoinette were present for the announcement in early 2022 and spoke to reporters. They said they were experiencing a roller coaster of emotions after finding out who killed their family member, but were thankful for finally having some closure. On November 17, 1978, a person cutting firewood near Lake of the Woods and the Dead Indian Highway in Oregon stumbled upon human remains. Klamath County sheriffs were notified and began their investigation and determined the victims were 19-year-old Kirk Leonard Weissman and 17-year-old Cynthia Lynn Freyer. They had both been shot and Cynthia had been sexually assaulted. Remains of a small dog were also found along with a dog carrier. It was determined that the couple had been hitchhiking through the area and had a sign that read K Falls, which stood for Klamath Falls, but investigators were unable to find any connection they had to it. They were originally from the suburb of Sepulveda in Los Angeles, California, and had hitchhiked all the way to Everett, Washington to visit relatives. On September 23, 1978, they boarded a plane in Everett along with their dog and flew to Eugene, Oregon. From there, it's believed they hitchhiked to Roseburg where they stayed the night in a motel. They were then picked up by someone that claimed to have dropped them off at a Grants Pass restaurant. One of the few items recovered from the scene was an unmailed letter written by Cynthia addressed to her mother, which mentioned the fund they recently had in Washington state and spoke of their hopes and dreams. Evidence collected from Cynthia was stored with hopes of later processing it with advancing technology. In 2018, they would try to identify a suspect by submitting multiple items to the Oregon State Police Crime Lab. In 2019, the lab was able to obtain DNA from an unknown male. The DNA recovered was entered into Cody's, but did not return any confirmed results. The lead detective reached out to Parabon Nanolabs for assistance regarding DNA forensics, a rather expensive request with a price tag of $8,000. A sample was produced in coordination with Marshall University that Parabon could analyze. In 2021, using genetic genealogy, C.C. Moore of Parabon was able to find a viable suspect. His children agreed to give their DNA for comparison and confirmed it was definitely a match. The viable suspect was confirmed as Ray Whitson Jr., who died in Texas in 1996 due to medical reasons. The detective spoke with his family and learned that Whitson had lived in the Klamath Falls area from 1976 to 1982 and his children had gone to school in that area. In that time, Whitson worked at a lumber mill near Klamath Falls and owned a small caliber pistol, the same type of caliber as the murder weapon. The area where the couple was found is the same route that he would take his family on camping trips and visit friends in the Ashland area. Through the investigation, it was determined that Whitson had no criminal record, and it remains unclear how the incident even happened. Whether the victims were hitchhiking from Ashland to Klamath Falls or back, it is believed that Whitson came upon them and offered a ride. Detectives were able to finally return evidence to Cynthia's family, including the letter she had written and a pair of her earrings. On New Year's Day of 1985 at 5 a.m., a family taking their sick dog to an all-night vet clinic found a woman's body in an empty lot at the corner of Peacock Drive and Creighton Road, just 1 block off Scenic Highway in Pensacola. Investigators were able to collect physical evidence from the body and the crime scene that showed the homicide was sexually motivated. DNA found on the victim would also match DNA found on a nearby towel that also had blood on it. The body belonged to Tanya Etheridge McKinley. Tanya was born January 25, 1961, and was 23 years old with an 18-month-old son at the time of her death. She was last seen alive around 1:30 a.m. at Daryl's Bar and Grill in Pensacola. Her sister Renee said she loved the band Kiss and Rod Stewart and was trying to make a better life for herself when she was killed. She loved her little boy, Timothy Davidson Jr., that the family called Timbo. The case would go unsolved for 35 years until Parabon Nanolabs began working with law enforcement. Parabon ran a DNA sample from the crime scene through an open-source genealogy database and identified several different possible distant cousins of the suspect. They then began creating a family tree, which eventually led them to the suspect. Police began surveilling him and gathered his DNA from a cigarette he threw out of the window while driving, which was tested and matched to the DNA found at the crime scene. The suspect was Daniel Leonard Wells of Milton, and he was charged with first-degree murder and sexual assault. He was arrested on May 20, 2020 and placed in the Escambia County Jail. His DNA was again tested, along with fingerprints found on items in Tanya's purse left at the scene. 2 weeks after his arrest, he hanged himself in his jail cell days before he was supposed to appear in court. According to court records, Wells was arrested in Pensacola in 1987 on battery and witness tampering charges. But the witness tampering charge was dropped after he pleaded no contest to the battery charge. In 1988, he was arrested on suspicion of solicitation of prostitution in Pensacola. Court records did not indicate the outcome of that case, but at the time of the murder, he lived on Elmcrest Drive, less than a mile from where the victim was found. Her father passed away in 2000 and her mother currently lives with Tanya's sister Renee. Her family said they are happy in knowing that Tanya can finally now rest. Tina Fells was born April 27, 1969 to Shirley and Stephen Fells. At the age of 14, she was a student at Foothill High School in Pleasanton, California. On April 5, 1984, Tina was walking home from school on a path that connected through Ashter Court to Lemonwood Way and through the I-680 underpass to her home in Valley Trails. She usually took the bus home, but she wanted to avoid some girls who were bullying her and had even thrown rocks at her. Instead, she took a shortcut through a drainage culvert close to the freeway that students would often walk through. After walking into the culvert, she was never seen alive again. At 325 that day, fellow students would find her body in the culvert. Sadly, with no witnesses or leads to follow, police were unable to make any progress in the case and it would go cold. 27 years later, in 2011, it was announced that DNA linked a spot of blood found on her purse that was left hanging on a branch to Stephen Carlson. Carlson was 16 years old at the time of the murder and was already in jail for unrelated crimes when he was charged with Tina's murder. During Carlson's trial, a former friend testified that on the day Carlson murdered Tina, Carlson was bullied and tossed into a dumpster at Foothill High School after a confrontation with members of the football team. He was also known to be into morbid things, and at times it involved animal cruelty. He was convicted of first-degree murder in 2014 and sentenced to 26 years to life in prison. 3 years later, a 3-judge court of appeal panel reduced the conviction to second-degree murder, saying prosecutors hadn't proved the element of premeditation and deliberate intent needed for a first-degree murder conviction, which decreased his sentence by 10 years. Carlson has a criminal record that includes convictions for drug and sexual crimes and now murder. He denied any involvement until 2020 when he finally confessed to her murder in a 9-page letter sent to her family. He also wrote a letter to Tina and the state parole commissioner. In the letter, he apologized and said he didn't intend to kill her. He recalled seeing Tina walking from school in the field across the street from his house. At the time, he was in a drunken rage over being bullied and laughed at by his classmates that day. He was also anticipating his parents coming home and seeing the damage to their room from a party he had thrown and believed his dad would attack him. He said he grabbed a knife from the kitchen and it all happened very fast. Before later moving away from the Pleasanton area, he had told peers that he had committed the crime, which made him a suspect but could not be linked to the crime, and he said he had just been joking. He also had severe problems with alcohol and drugs, which only increased after Tina's murder, especially since he dropped out of high school. Tina's remains were cremated and scattered over the Yosemite National Park. While it took 27 years to solve the crime, at least her family now has some closure. Daryl Renee Johnson was born September 24, 1972 to Deanna and Dennis Johnson. At the age of 9, she lived in Nampa, Idaho at 552 Greenleaf Street, and was a fourth-grade student at Lincoln Elementary School. She was on the Optimist Club soccer team, loved animals and her family. She was described as a good student and a little shy until she got to know you. On February 24, 1982, she left home at 8 a.m. and began walking to school, which was about 6 blocks away. She only made it about half a block to the intersection of Greenleaf and High Street when she was abducted. Some school children told detectives at the time they'd seen a suspicious vehicle in the area. It would take 3 days of extensive searching before her body was found by a group of fishermen in a shallow drainage ditch in Melba, Idaho, along the Snake River. While her death was ruled a homicide, the actual details are way too brutal for this video. Not even a year later, her neighbor, Charles Irvin Fain, was convicted of her murder and sentenced to death. He had owned a vehicle matching the description of the suspicious vehicle, which had been seen by the other children who were playing near where Daryl had disappeared. Even though he passed a polygraph test, it wasn't admissible in court. A forensic expert from the FBI claimed that 3 hairs found on Daryl and his body were probably Fain's. Also, 2 jailhouse informants claimed that he had confessed to them about the murder. As the years went by, Fain always maintained his innocence and never gave up on trying to prove it. Finally, in 2001, nearly 18 years after his conviction, he was exonerated and released from death row and the case reopened. 6 years later, Fain was issued nearly $1.4 million in compensation because of the Idaho Wrongful Conviction Act. The FBI has formally acknowledged that for decades, examiners from the FBI Laboratory's Microscopic Hair Comparison Unit provided flawed forensic testimony to favor prosecutors in over 90% of their cases. Today, microscopic hair interpretations are rarely used as corroborating evidence. Nowadays, if a hair has an attached root, nuclear DNA can usually be obtained. A hair without a root, for the most part, can only produce mitochondrial DNA, which is much more challenging and less detailed. Years later, forensic testing showed that those 3 pubic hairs on her body belonged to convicted sex offender David Allen Dalrymple. Using the DNA profile, a genetic genealogist was led to a Dalrymple family tree branch of 4 sons and 2 daughters. After ruling out 5 of a set of 6 Dalrymple siblings, the remaining David Dalrymple could not be excluded. He was living in Nampa at the time of the murder, which he denied during questioning. He also said he was in the military, but investigators knew that he was discharged in 1981, a year prior to the murder. He refused to give a DNA sample, but a warrant ordered the DNA collection which matched the hair found on Daryl's underwear. Investigators believe that Dalrymple may have had additional victims. He was a violent man who had even told one of his sexual abuse victims that he would make her disappear if she ever went to the police. At the age of 62, he was charged with Daryl's sexual assault and murder. He was already serving time for kidnapping, lewd conduct, and sexual abuse involving a minor in 2004. That same year, he was also convicted of second-degree kidnapping in a separate case. More than a decade earlier, in 1991, he was convicted of battery. His victim reported that she was assaulted and told she deserved to be killed. In 1991, he had choked a woman, but the aggravated assault charge was later amended to misdemeanor battery. These are just a fraction of the assaults he committed on women and minors. Police believe he has more victims and have identified at least 2 other young girls who say they were molested by him but never reported it. Daryl was loved by many, but her life was tragically taken. Thankfully, her real killer now remains behind bars, and I personally hope that one day someone will take that smirky-ass grin off his face. Candace Elaine Rogers was an only child born to Elaine and Carl Rogers and was known by her family as Candy. At the age of 9, she was a 4th grader at Holmes Elementary School, lived in Spokane, Washington, and was described as friendly, shy, and well-mannered. On the afternoon of March 6, 1959, she set out walking to sell mints for the Campfire Girls near her home at 2106 1/2 West Mission Avenue. This was the last time she was ever seen alive. After she went missing, 6 boxes of Campfire mints were found strewn along Pettit Drive. Over the next 2 weeks, more than 1,200 searchers scoured the area for her. 3 Fairchild Air Force Base airmen searching in a helicopter for Candy tragically died the day after she went missing when they accidentally flew into high-voltage lines over the Spokane River. Meanwhile, 2 other airmen hunting in some woods found a pair of girls' blue suede shoes about 7 miles from Candy's home, leading to a more extensive search of that area. The next day, March 22nd, 16 days after Candy went missing, her body was found. She was found about 3.5 miles northwest of Spokane Falls Community College, about 200 yards from an abandoned rock quarry, and 130 feet off Old Trails Road. Her death was ruled a homicide and would go unsolved for 62 years. Grape-smelling gum found on her clothes appeared to link her murder to Hugh Bion Morse, a serial killer known to chew that flavor who had allegedly killed at least 4 women. He was the suspected killer until 2001 when DNA evidence would clear him. Another potential suspect was 50-year-old Alfred Graves, who lived on North Cannon Street and was found to have collected clippings about women and children who had been sexually assaulted. Strangely, the day Candy's body was found, he committed suicide in his car by way of carbon monoxide. Another potential suspect was James Howard Barnett, who hanged himself in jail in 1960 for days after he was arrested on suspicion of a sex crime against a child. In 2021, the Spokane Police Department enlisted the help of Othram Incorporated, who was able to take the degraded DNA of the killer and create a genetic profile. It was then uploaded to online genetic databases, and the genetic genealogists were able to narrow the match down to 3 brothers. One of those brothers was John Rehoff, who was 20 years old at the time of the murder and lived near Keene but was never a suspect. However, they were unable to immediately obtain his DNA because on June 30th, 1970, he committed suicide, but thankfully his daughter assisted police in solving the case by submitting DNA samples. The results showed it was 2.9 million times more likely that Hoff's daughter's DNA was related to the recovered specimen than the general population. This allowed investigators a warrant to exhume his body to collect DNA. His DNA indicated with a probability threshold of 25 quintillion that the semen found on Candy's clothing came from him. In 1961, 2 years after Candy's murder, he was arrested for strangling and robbing a woman in Brown's Addition and served 6 months in jail for the assault. He used the same MO as Candy's killing. He was also an army deserter who became a door-to-door salesman. He was previously buried in the same cemetery as Candy, but his family moved his remains to another site after learning he was responsible for her death. Candy's parents were divorced at the time of her murder. Her father killed himself in June 1963 in a hotel in Walla Walla, Washington, and sadly her mother died in September 2006, never knowing who had taken her daughter's life. Anita Mae Knudsen was born September 22, 1988, and was adopted at 5 months old by Gordon and Sharon Knudsen. She attended school in California and even wrote and published a book while in the 8th grade. In 2002, she moved with her family to Butte, North Dakota, where she went to Velva High School. She was very active in school and graduated with honors in 2006. She was described as a tenacious and a passionate young woman, the type of person to defend someone being bullied or picked on, and always stood up for what was right. At the age of 18, she had already completed her freshman semester at Monarch State University, where she was majoring in elementary education. She had been working 2 jobs to pay for school, one at the Fairfield Inn as a housekeeper and the other working retail in the mall for Vanity. She was living with a roommate in an off-campus apartment at 2420 4th Street, NW in Minot, North Dakota. On June 4, 2007, her parents became concerned when they could not get in touch with her for 3 days. She also didn't show up for work. Gordon drove about an hour to her apartment to check on her, and when he arrived, her car was parked outside, but it seemed no one was home. The apartment was locked, so he found the landlady and the maintenance worker to ask for help. The maintenance worker said he had seen a sliced window screen lying on the ground that morning. When Gordon went to look for the screen, he realized it was from his daughter's bedroom window. He peered into Anita's bedroom window and saw his daughter lying face down in her bed. He reached in and touched her and realized she was gone. She had been stabbed to death and her body had been covered by a large house coat. Officers arrived and found a pocket knife with dried blood nearby. Her laptop, cell phone, purse with cash inside, and digital camera were all in her bedroom, proving that there had not been a robbery. Only 4 keys existed and belonged to the landlady Laura Knapp, the maintenance worker Marty Annell, Anita, and her roommate Nicole. The police initially investigated 2 persons of interest, the maintenance worker and a fellow tenant in the building named Tyler. Tyler was an onlooker that day behind the crime scene tape and was known to have a crush on Anita. There were no signs that anyone had entered through Anita's bedroom window where the screen had been taken out. Traces of blood were found where the screen was cut, indicating it was probably sliced after the murder to stage the scene and mislead law enforcement. It didn't appear that anyone went through the window and nothing was disturbed beneath the window. It is also possible that after being sliced from the inside, the screen was pushed outwards onto the ground. Her autopsy revealed that she had not been sexually assaulted. Her time of death was determined to most likely be during the early morning hours of Sunday. But the last text message she replied to was close to 5 a.m. Saturday morning. This leads some to speculate that she could have been held hostage throughout all of Saturday. Police questioned Anita's friends, neighbors, and construction workers who were on a job nearby. They found traces of DNA on the pocket knife and took samples from the people they interviewed. Police also spoke to Anita's roommate, Nicole Rice. Nicole allegedly told police officers she was with her family all weekend. But investigators suspected something was off with Nicole's story. Statements given by Nicole and her parents were allegedly inconsistent and contradictory. Several friends told police that Anita and Nicole often fought and there was a lot of tension between the 2 girls. Not only that, but Nicole was known for having a very hot temper. One thing they didn't agree on was Nicole often having men over and then leaving them there while she went to school or work. Shockingly, Nicole's mother reportedly showed up to Anita's funeral, and a verbal altercation occurred between her and Anita's mother. Nicole's mother was angry that her daughter had been questioned by police. Anita's mother stated that Anita was scared of Rice. She had allegedly sent Anita threatening messages, and Anita was planning on moving out. The police chief said investigators never ruled out Rice as a suspect, but they did not have enough evidence to arrest her initially. That was until the Oxygen Channel's Cole Justice took on the case and were able to obtain new information and get a break in the case. This led to the Minot Police Department re-interviewing suspects and witnesses earlier this year. Investigators received several tips about Rice, including one that said while intoxicated, Rice told a former boyfriend that she did it. The man later tried to ask her about the confession when she was sober, but she allegedly got angry and refused to answer. It also states that Rice's statements and her family's statements about where she was the night of the murder were inconsistent. Rice said she was at her family's farm in Velva at the time, but a witness placed her at a bar in Rousseau on June 2, 2007 until the early morning of June 3. Nicole told a witness that after she left the club in Rousseau, she had to go to Minot to her apartment to get some clothes that night. The same witness said that Rice had changed her story multiple times and that she told her details about the crime scene that wouldn't have been known to anyone outside of the investigation team. Rice and her father previously told officers that she was at her parents' house from approximately 7 p.m. on Saturday, June 2 until the morning of June 4, 2007. Those statements have changed several times and contradict each other. On March 16, 2022, Minot police announced the arrest of 34-year-old Nicole Rice 15 years after the murder. Rice was arrested at Minot Air Force Base where she worked as a civilian. She was taken to Ward County Jail and released the next day on a $120,000 cash bond paid by her father. In 2012, she pleaded guilty to 2 counts of issuing checks without sufficient funds. She did not appear in court or pay the fees and was charged with bail jumping. Authorities did not provide details on the evidence that pointed to Rice. As of now, Rice is due back in court April 21, 2022. Cynthia Cole was a loving mother described as having a kind and caring personality. Her friends described her as funny, upbeat, and fiercely loved the Lord, life, and the ocean. At the age of 57, she lived in Jensen Beach and employed a handyman, 34-year-old Kyoke Demich, to perform duties in and around her house for the past 6 years to help him financially. On Thursday, February 24th, and she was last seen at a community music and arts event known as the Jammin' Jensen in Jensen Beach. After the festival, her friends grew suspicious when they hadn't heard from her for several days. She was known to be a creature of habit and posted daily sunset pictures on her social media accounts and stayed in regular contact with her loved ones. Also, her friends did not see her 2015 grade cheap Cherokee in front of her home as it usually was, and she didn't show up to a party on Friday, February 25th, or a doctor's appointment. She wasn't responding to text and phone calls either, and so her friend Lou Ann reported her missing. She told them that Cynthia did not have any mental health or addiction issues and wasn't depressed or suicidal. Deputies went to her house that same day and then the next. They also did not find her Jeep at the home, but they did find her purse inside along with her driver's license. It didn't appear that she had been home for some time. Meanwhile, her friend Lou Ann pointed law enforcement to Cynthia's handyman, Keok Dimich. He had told Lou Ann that Cynthia was supposed to pick him up on Saturday, February 26th, but she never showed up. Cell phone records showed that she sent Dimich a text around 2:40 a.m. on Friday, February 25th saying, "Keith, sent you some money to finish the house off. I'll call you Saturday morning when I'm on my way." Location data also showed Cynthia was at her home late on Thursday, February 24th, and early the next day. Detectives spoke with Dimich on March 2nd, and he agreed to hand over his phone. Investigators said they found a money transfer from Cynthia to Dimich on Cash App at 3:46 a.m. on Friday, February 25th. But the text from her was not on his phone and appeared to have been deleted. During questioning, Dimich told detectives that he often did work on her house on the weekends and that she paid him in cash, never via an app. He said the last time he saw her was on February 22nd, when he was at her house inspecting her air conditioner. When detectives asked him about the missing text message, Dimich allegedly claimed he lost his phone at a gas station on February 24th, adding that when he replaced it, his new phone did not show the text he missed in the interim. But he later changed his story, saying that he lost his phone while riding his bike on February 25th. He admitted to lying about the phone, and he stated that he lies often. Detectives began surveilling Dimich, and on March 4th, they found Cynthia's Jeep in a parking lot just walking distance from his home. Surveillance footage showed him walking multiple times towards and away from the area where the Jeep was located in the early morning hours of Friday, February 25th. According to reports, a subpoena for his Lyft account also showed that he ordered a car to her home around 7 p.m. on Thursday, February 24th, the day she was reportedly last seen. After finding her Jeep, detectives returned to her house to do another search. While there, they happened to notice that the cover to the septic tank was cracked open and didn't look right. Once opened, they could see a body. An all-consuming excavation ensued for many hours until Cynthia's body was located and recovered. An autopsy showed that she had suffered blunt force trauma to her head and abdomen and may have died of suffocation after being placed in the tank. After finding the body, detectives called Dimich back to the station where they questioned him again. He admitted to going to her house the night she disappeared and said he had driven her car to the parking lot. He was then arrested and charged with second-degree murder, but the motive is unclear. He was found guilty of failing to register with the DMV as a sex offender in St. Lucie Circuit Court a few years ago. On Christmas 2017, he posted on Facebook about losing a loved one, and Cynthia replied, "Keoki, I'm so very sorry. I love you and I'm here for you." Patricia Lorraine Barnes was born in Great Falls, Montana, and would later have 2 sons. She had lived in homeless shelters in the Pioneer Square neighborhood of Seattle, Washington. She was known as the Towel Lady because she usually wore a towel or bandana around her head to cover her hair, which was burned in an apartment fire. She bounced between shelters in Seattle and frequently stayed around the Pioneer Square area. On August 25, 1995, at the age of 61, her body was found in a ditch along Peacock Hill Road in Olalla, Washington. She had died from a gunshot wound, but authorities reported that she apparently was killed elsewhere and her body moved to where she was ultimately found. At the time, it was believed she was another victim of the Spokane serial killer, later identified as Robert Lee Yates. However, he was excluded as a suspect after learning that he was stationed at Fort Rucker, Alabama at the time of her murder. It took detectives 3 days to identify Patricia through fingerprint records, which they had when she was convicted of a misdemeanor in Wenatchee several years ago. Roughly 130 pieces of evidence were collected, including DNA from a cigarette, but that was found near her. The same DNA was also found on her body and on items around her body. But detectives were unable to identify a suspect. Witnesses saw her with a man the day she was last seen and were able to provide enough details for a sketch to be created. 3 days before she was found, she had a $300 check with her and had asked the director of Broadview Emergency Shelter to hold it for her. But the woman suggested Patricia go cash the check and deposit it in a bank. She was then seen in the downtown area with a white man in his 30s who was in the Seattle Work Release Program, and the two told another man that they planned to go eat at Courthouse Park and then go to Federal Way. The case would then go cold for well over 20 years. The case would start to get attention again in April 2018 when the Cold Case Division of Kitsap County reopened it. In August 2020, DNA material was obtained via search warrant of a person of interest believed to be the last person in contact with Patricia. However, they were not a match and were excluded as a suspect. It was determined that the DNA found at the crime scene belonged to a single unidentified man. But when ran through the Cody's database, no match was found. The sheriff's office partnered with Othram, and within months, Othram's scientists built a genealogical profile of the suspect and shared his information with authorities in December 2021. The name given was Douglas Keith Crone. However, he had died in 2016 in Arizona after he was electrocuted while installing some sort of TV antenna that hit power lines. A DNA sample collected in Crone's post-mortem exam was given to the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab, whose detectives compared it to the DNA samples recovered from the crime scene 26 years ago, and it was a match. Crone was an Army vet and convicted robber. He was 33 at the time of the murder and had addresses in both Seattle and Tacoma. He had an extensive criminal history in Washington in the 80s and 90s, including 5 felony convictions of first-degree robbery, second-degree kidnapping, and 3 others. Su Ming Tang immigrated with his family from Taiwan to California to provide a better life for them. He owned and worked at a corner store, the Devonshire Little Store on Devonshire Boulevard in San Carlos, California. On April 26, 1993, he was fatally shot while working at the store. A woman was seen leaving the store after the shooting in an apparent robbery gone wrong. Investigators knew that the suspect was described as a woman in her 20s with brown shoulder-length hair in a faded blue 1970s station wagon. But the case would go cold for 29 years. The case was reassigned in 2018, and San Mateo County Sheriff's detectives, crime analysts, and cold case investigators reviewed the investigation and identified a person of interest living in Washington County, Oklahoma, using advanced technology. On March 16, 2022, detectives arrested 61-year-old Reina Hoffman Ramos in Oklahoma for his murder. Detectives say Hoffman Ramos was a resident in San Mateo at the time of the murder but had moved to Oklahoma in recent years and has a criminal history. Police shared the news of the arrest with Tang's family. Hoffman Ramos was booked on a first-degree murder charge, and police have not released what evidence led to her arrest. They did say, however, that she is believed to have acted alone. Chung Sun, the current owner of Devonshire Little Store, bought the store from Tang's wife in July 1993. Sun immigrated to the U.S. from Taiwan with his son and daughter and said he was hoping to live in San Carlos to give his kids a good education. Between 1982 and 1985, in Shelby County, Indiana, a perpetrator was entering the homes of innocent victims with a mask on, armed with a gun or knife, and then forced the women at home to perform lewd sexual acts. In order to get the women to comply, he would threaten to hurt their children. In some of these cases, the females were home alone. In others, their husbands were home, with one man being tied up and beaten, resulting in permanent disabilities following a coma that lasted for months. At times, he forced couples to engage in acts and often took pictures. He even had the audacity to often ask for a Pepsi to drink. He always wore military-style boots and a ski mask. At least 10 victims came forward during these 3 years and reported rapes, including one mother and daughter. Although the perpetrator cautiously wiped down the scene and took items that he touched with him, He unknowingly left DNA behind at one of the crime scenes. It was sent in to Parabon Nanolabs for advanced DNA testing, and a profile was created resulting in a list of 2 possible suspects, the Hessler brothers. Further testing narrowed it down to Stephen Ray Hessler. Using an envelope that Hessler used to pay a utility bill in Greensburg where he lived, investigators were able to match his DNA to the DNA found at the crime scene. They then executed a search warrant at Hessler's residence in the early morning hours of August 17, 2020, and found a slew of evidence. Stolen photographs were found that were stolen from one victim, and computers would show that Hessler had been tracking down 2 other victims. 23 Polaroid pictures were found in a safe of couples that he had forced to perform acts. He had even downloaded a Google Earth Street View photo of one victim's house in Georgia. Also seized from Hessler's home were items used or seen during the attacks, including a black coat, black gloves, a black ski mask, black military-style boots, chain-style wallets, knives, handcuffs and keys, a shoulder gun holster, multiple enema water bags, and jars of petroleum jelly that was used during each attack. All the items match descriptions given by the victims in the 1980s attacks. The prosecution also pointed out hundreds of searches on Hessler's computers about the cases and the victims. Hessler spent 1990 to 1999 in an Indiana prison for a similar crime. In 1988, he entered a home at 3 a.m. with a gun while the man of the house was at work, forcing a woman to leave her child alone and walk barefoot through the streets and alleys to another home where he violated her. After trial in early 2022, Hessler was convicted of 2 counts of rape, 6 counts of unlawful deviant conduct, 7 counts of burglary resulting in bodily injury, 3 counts of criminal deviant conduct, and 1 count of robbery, each as a Class A felony. Some victims bravely testified despite having received death threats during the attacks. 27 witnesses were called, and some had to be flown in from as far as Florida and Georgia, as well as a Secret Service computer technician from the East Coast. Hessler will be sentenced on April 1, 2022, and faces up to 50 years in prison for each count. In the early morning hours of October 28, 1994, a Seattle Times newspaper delivery person called 911 when he saw a woman's body at the end of 55th Street, a remote dead-end street in Renton, Washington. When the officers arrived, they found a woman and young boy lying in the middle of the road next to a car, both shot to death. The bodies belonged to 23-year-old Stacy and Falcon Dewey and her 3-year-old son, Jacob Dewey. Investigators recovered 5 38mm cartridge casings from the scene, 3 near the bodies and 2 inside of the 1984 Buick Century, which belonged to Stacy. Police say there was a struggle at the scene based on evidence collected, and Stacy had been sexually assaulted. Some of the contents of Stacy's purse were strewn about the vehicle, including her wallet. Several items had also been thrown out of the passenger side door onto the street, including buttons from Stacy's shirt, her shoes, the car's floor mat, and packaging tape which was used during the crime. Putting together a timeline, police determined that Stacy had spent the evening celebrating her birthday with friends while Jacob was being cared for by his regular babysitter. She then picked up Jacob from the babysitter's apartment at the Kenton Ridge apartment complex between 1:20 a.m. and 2 a.m., less than 5 miles from where they were killed. Stacy had previously lived at the apartment complex in Kent, Washington, but had moved out months earlier. She was seen getting into the car with Jacob, and her boyfriend was expecting them home soon in Kent. 2 people who lived nearby where they were found told police that they heard what sounded like gunshots just after 2 a.m. Despite an extensive investigation, detectives were unable to come up with a suspect or person of interest in the case for nearly a decade. But by 2001, there were advances in DNA and genetic testing. So several pieces of evidence collected from the crime scene were sent to the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab. The evidence included fingernail clippings and swabs of semen obtained from Stacy's autopsy. In 2002, this DNA evidence was matched to Jerome Frank Jones. Shockingly, Stacy and Jacob's murder case then slipped through the cracks and remained officially unsolved for the next 16 years. When DNA was matched to Jones in 2002, the cold case detective presented the evidence to prosecutors for charges. Once it was realized that Jones was already behind bars and would be there for a long period of time, they decided to hold off. Then, 16 years later, the case became the subject of a Seattle Times series, titled In the Dark, which told of how the case, although seemingly solved, was neglected for years with Jones not being charged. Stacy's mother didn't even officially learn about the DNA tying Jones to her daughter's and grandson's murders until March 2019, 25 years after their murders. Even then, she only heard about it from a Seattle Times reporter, not law enforcement. Jones was already serving a 56-year sentence for murdering 30-year-old businessman Gregory Hebden in Irvine, California, just 5 months after the murders of Stacy and Jacob. He has an extensive criminal record for felony assaults, robbery, drug possession, and the murder in California. Once known as Rome Dog, he grew up near Compton, California, and was part of the Crips gang in the 80s and 90s. His first conviction was for crack possession in 1993 in Washington. While in custody for the murder of Mr. Hebden, he brutally assaulted a corrections officer and was convicted of 2 felony assaults and felony weapon possession. He is currently eligible for parole in 2030, but if he's convicted of Stacy and Jacob's murders, he will most likely receive life in prison. Investigators flew to California to interview Jones in prison. He confirmed he lived near Renton, Washington from 1994 to 1995, but did not ever meeting or knowing Stacy. Investigators said they then confirmed that Jones had lived at the Kenton Ridge apartment complex at the same time as Stacy and Jacob, and that he was in the area on the night of their murders. In December of 2021, new investigators learned that Jones's DNA matched samples found on the jacket that little Jacob was wearing when he was killed. 27 years after their lives were taken by yet another waste of space, he was finally charged with 2 counts of first-degree aggravated murder in February 2022. Jones is scheduled to appear for arraignment on February 28th at the Maling Regional Justice Center in Kent, Washington. In 1993, 20-year-old Sophie Sergi was employed as a teacher's assistant and lived in the small village of Pitcairn Point, Alaska. In April of 1993, she flew to Bethel and then to Anchorage to have her braces adjusted at the orthodontist and spent the night with a family friend. She then flew to Fairbanks and went to the University of Alaska Fairbanks. She was a previous student there from 1990 to 1992, but had taken time off to move home and save money for orthodontic work she needed done. While there, she was staying with Shirley Masully for a couple of days, who was living in a dorm at the Bartlett Hall at the university. Sophie stepped out a little after midnight to smoke a cigarette, and as she was leaving the room, Shirley told her that she could go smoke near the exhaust fence and the tub room of the women's bathroom because it was too cold outside. While Sophie was gone for a smoke, Shirley and her boyfriend Noah Taylor left to go spend the rest of the night in Noah's dorm. At some point in the evening, her friend took a photo of Sophie. This would unknowingly be her final picture before her life was sadly taken. It was the end of the term, and people were coming and going from campus, and anyone could have access to the women's floor using the elevator or the stairs. The next morning, her friend returned about 9 a.m. and noticed the dorm room unlocked and Sophie gone. She was irritated that Sophie had left the door unlocked and assumed she was out taking a long shower. Strangely, the room appeared to be the same as she had left it, and the note she had left Sophie letting her know she would be staying the rest of the night with Noah was still on the door. Shirley didn't think much of it at the time, but later realized this all indicated that Sophie never returned. Later in the day, she contacted the orthodontist and was told that Sophie had never made her appointment. That afternoon on April 26th, a janitor found her body in the common area dormitory bathtub. She had been murdered and sexually assaulted. With no leads, the case would go cold for 16 long years. Investigators were bumfuzzled as to how no one had heard a gunshot that night. The tub room was a small, separate room next to the shower stalls in the east bathroom and had a shower stall-type swinging door at the entrance of the room. A female resident of Bartlett Hall indicated she was in the shower on the second floor at approximately 1:30 a.m. on April 26. The shower stall shared a wall with the tub room where Sophie's body would later be discovered. The girl reported hearing noises coming from that room, including thumping and muffled voices, but apparently didn't check it out or report it. After she was found, the dormitory was never locked down to search for evidence outside the bathroom where she was murdered. They were, however, able to collect DNA from the crime scene. In 2019, the suspect's DNA was matched to a likely suspect through genetic genealogy. 44-year-old nurse Stephen Downs was arrested in Auburn, Maine for the murder of Sophie. He was only 18 years old at the time he committed the murder. Downs was not identified as a suspect until authorities discovered a DNA match with his aunt who had uploaded a sample to a commercial online genealogy database. Investigators then obtained a sample of Downs when they executed a search warrant at his home in Auburn, Maine on February 14, 2019. The sample matched the DNA taken from the crime scene. Downs was a freshman at the university in 1993 and lived in the same dorm where Sophie was killed, but lived on one of the male floors. Downs did not testify, but jurors heard a recording of his conversation with investigators in which he denied knowing Sophie and denied keeping a gun in his dorm room. In the recordings, he told police he was with his then-girlfriend the night Sophie died. However, she testified during the trial that he had actually left the room several times that evening. An expert testified that Sophie died from a .22 caliber bullet and from a knife wound. Downs' friend and then roommate testified that he owned guns and a large hunting knife, including a .22 caliber pistol. His former roommate, Nicholas Dozier, at the time was a security officer on campus who was later fired for owning a firearm which was not allowed in the dorms. Dozier was on duty the night of Sophie's murder, and he subsequently assisted police on the 26th in making sure the crime scene was not disturbed. After attending college at UAF, from 1992 to 1996, Downs lived in Tucson, Arizona from 1998 to 2003 before he ultimately returned to Maine. Downs was fired from a nursing job for making female coworkers uncomfortable with inappropriate behavior and medication handling errors. Downs is the first man in Alaska to stand trial for a charge that resulted from genetic genealogy. No motive was given for the killing, and it is unclear if he and Sophie knew each other prior to her death. He was ultimately convicted of first-degree murder and first-degree sexual assault on February 9, 2022. Jessica Suzanne Gutierrez, who went by Jessie, was born December 3, 1981 to Deborah and David Gutierrez. In 1983, when Jessie was 2 years old, her parents would divorce. At the age of 4, Jessie lived with her mother and 8-year-old brother and shared a bedroom with her 2 sisters in their mobile home in the Edmond community in Lexington, South Carolina. Jessie's mother, Deborah, awoke the morning of June 6, 1986 to find her daughter missing from the bed, where she normally slept with her 2 sisters, ages 6 and 10. She asked her other children if they knew where Jessie was, but they did not. The front door was unlocked, which had previously been bolted the night before. She checked the yard and then called family to help her search for Jessie in the surrounding woods around the home. One thing that always stood out was something Jessie's 6-year-old sister, Rebecca, had said to their mother. The man with the magic hat and the beard had taken Jessie. Rebecca, now an adult, remembers seeing a man lift Jessie out of the bed and carry her away, and the man was able to do this without waking Jessie. Rebecca was lying right next to Jessie, but had been too frightened to tell anyone until the next morning when Jessie was discovered missing. Investigators later determined that someone had entered the family's mobile home sometime between midnight and 7:30 a.m. The abductor had removed the window screen and curtains from a living room window and climbed inside. The kidnapper then left with her through the front door. Authorities searched by land and by air for little Jessie, but never found her. Deborah initially blamed her ex-boyfriend because she had broken up with him a few days before, but he said he had no idea where Jessie was. The man was repeatedly questioned by police but never charged. Authorities tried to locate Jessie's father, and he was last known to be living in Mexico City. However, he was ruled out as a suspect in the case as he had been living in California at the time of her abduction. A family acquaintance, Thomas McDowell of West Columbia, was suspected because a long fingerprint of his was found on Jessie's bedroom window. Deborah told detectives she cleaned the windows of the home every night and the only fingerprint found belonged to McDowell. The print was matched to McDowell 10 weeks after the kidnapping because his fingerprints were put on file when he was convicted of breaking into a woman's home and sexually assaulting her in North Carolina. In 1987, McDowell would be sentenced to 10 years in prison on a rape charge. Deborah also found fibers in an abandoned car that were linked to her daughter. a car which had been connected to McDowell. In 1987, McDowell allegedly told a cellmate that he had kidnapped a girl in Lexington County and buried her body in a landfill in that same county. He mentioned that he was wearing a tall cowboy hat at the time of the kidnapping, which might explain the magic hat that Rebecca had mentioned. His cellmate told authorities about his statements, and when police confronted McDowell, he offered to confess if he got immunity from prosecution for the crime. Immunity was denied, and McDowell did not speak any further on the subject. Deputies searched the landfill, but Jesse's body was never found. Finally, 35 years later, on January 6, 2022, 61-year-old Thomas Eric McDowell was arrested from his home on 842 North White Street in Wake Forest, North Carolina, and charged with Jesse's murder. His older brother Charles McDowell was sent to California's death row in 1984 for murder as well. Lexington County authorities did not give details of any new evidence against McDowell that may have led to his arrest. For 35 years, Jesse's mother has fought tooth and nail to find justice for her daughter. And while she faced many hurdles, she never gave up the fight for her daughter. Sadly, her body has not been found. But the evil, heartless bastard Thomas McDowell will finally spend the rest of his life behind bars. Roxanne Lee Wood was born and raised in Niles Township, Michigan. At the age of 30, she worked in the customer service department of Automated Molded Plastics Company in South Bend, Indiana. On February 20th, 1987, Roxanne and her husband, Terry, spent the evening at a bar called H-Ice Old Town Saloon in downtown Niles where they lived. Today, that bar is known as The Rage. They then went to the now-defunct White's Bowling Lanes on 11th Street, which is now Martin's Supermarket. Roxanne left the bowling alley around midnight, and Terry was about 45 minutes behind her as they had taken separate vehicles. When he arrived to the couple's home on Tam-O-Shantair Lane, just south of Niles Township, he found a horrible scene. His wife was on the kitchen floor and had been murdered and possibly sexually assaulted. For the next 35 years, Terry remained a suspect in his wife's murder, but he was never arrested because the DNA at the scene didn't match him. Authorities would find the sheath of the knife, but the weapon itself was never recovered. Divers spent hours searching for the knife in Brandywine Creek near the crime scene, but was never able to find anything. In 2020, investigators reopened the case, and by February of 2021, 34 years after the murder, investigators had received a tip from a credible and very reliable source that one man in particular should be looked into. A year later, in February 2022, 67-year-old Patrick Gillum was arrested at his home on East Bowman Street in South Bend, Indiana, and charged with Roxanne's murder. While authorities initially withheld the evidence that led to Gillum's arrest, it has since been revealed that his DNA was obtained from a discarded cigarette and matched DNA found on Roxanne at the crime scene. Upon further investigation, it was determined that he was in the area when she was killed and only lived about 10 miles south of Niles at the time. When she was murdered, Gillum was out on parole for burglary and criminal deviant conduct and had been released only 6 months prior. Thankfully, he is now behind bars, and Roxanne's family finally has some closure. 74-year-old Russell Hill and 73-year-old Carol Clay were secret lovers for decades and were both married but not to each other. In March 2020, Russell left his home in Druin and picked Carol up from her home in Pakenham, Australia, and the pair headed to go camping in the Victoria High Country. Russell was an avid outdoorsman, and he often spent time in the area camping. Miss Clay, a former Victorian Country Women's Association president, told friends she was heading out of town and was expected to return home on March 28th or 29th. However, she would never make it home, and both her and Russell would go missing. Russell made a call from a radio on March 20th saying he was at one in Gauden Valley. The next day, on March 21st, his Toyota Land Cruiser was found at their campsite near Dry River Creek Track. It had been set on fire and burned along with their campsite and tent, which someone had placed a stove in. A year later, in April 2021, cadaver dogs searched the area and 2 shovels were found near Great Alpine Road, about 62 miles from where the couple disappeared. Not only was Russell's family shocked that he was missing, but also shocked that he had a secret lover. Carol's sister, Jill, was aware of the affair and stated that the couple had been camping several times in the past. The footage from roadside cameras around the area where the pair disappeared were analyzed by detectives who accounted for every vehicle that left the valley that weekend except for one. A year and a half after they went missing, a picture of a blue four-wheel drive truck pulling a trailer was released. It had been seen in the area at the time the couple disappeared. Soon after, the owner of the truck was arrested, 55-year-old Greg Lynn, a Jetstar pilot of Carolyn Springs. He was arrested at a remote campsite in Arbuckle Junction and charged with the couple's murder on November 25, 2021. 5 days later, remains were located by forensic experts in the remote Union Spur track area north of Dargo, a town in Victoria's Gippsland region in the Grants historical area. Police were unable to confirm their identities right away, and it took over 2 months for the forensic testing. Found with the remains was a ring and a set of dentures. Lynn allegedly murdered the campers on the day they arrived at the Wanangana Valley in the Victorian Alps. Detectives have been on the lookout for his dark blue Nissan Patrol, but Lynn had painted it gold or beige after the couple vanished. Police have not announced what evidence led to his arrest, but stated it's believed an altercation occurred between the campers after Russell radioed his location to his wife and friend and after setting up his camp. At the age of 21, Mary Jane Thompson was an aspiring model and worked at a florist shop and a restaurant in Dallas, Texas. She had previously lived in Houston and Los Angeles, but moved to Dallas about 6 months before her untimely death in February 1984. On February 11, 1984, she was taken a bus to the Trinity Medical Clinic before she was tragically murdered. Turns out the clinic wasn't even open that day. 2 days later, her body was found behind a warehouse in the 2300 block of Irving Boulevard in the Stemmons corridor. She had been strangled and sexually assaulted. With no leads, the case would go cold, but in 2009 was reopened. After being reopened, investigators would have the swabs from the autopsy sent off for DNA testing. A male DNA profile was identified, but it never matched to any suspects, and once again the case went cold. In 2018, the case was once again reopened by Dallas Police cold case homicide detective No Camacho, who worked with a team from the Dallas County DA's Sexual Assault Kit Initiative. 2 years later, in 2020, the FBI would join the task force and the case would be submitted for forensic genetic genealogy research. Eventually, a possible suspect was identified. In February 2022, DNA testing confirmed the match, and investigators were able to arrest 60-year-old Edward Morgan of Dallas and charge him with the murder. Mary's sister, Selena, and other family members were all very thankful that her killer has finally been captured and is finally behind bars. 47-year-old Daryl Dwayne Bowden of Linden, North Carolina will spend the next 22 years behind bars for committing a series of 6 sexual assaults between 2006 and 2008 in Fayetteville, North Carolina. Before DNA connected him to the crimes, he was dubbed the Ramsey Street Rapist because all of the crimes occurred on or near Ramsey Street in Fayetteville. During the investigation, law enforcement reached out to Peerbond Nanolabs, who created composite snapshots of what the suspect may look like today. The snapshots were created using DNA left behind at 3 of the crime scenes and by using descriptions given by victims of his. A judge ordered police to extract his DNA, and it was a match. Throughout 2006, a woman reported being assaulted at the Village at Carver Falls at Ramsey Street in Carver Falls Road. Then a 23-year-old woman was assaulted after a man grabbed her from behind while she was jogging and training for a marathon in the area of Ramsey Street and Oates Drive. After assaulting her in the woods, he had the audacity to ask for her name and what she would be doing later. Throughout 2007, a 44-year-old woman living in Kings Grant condominiums on Bubble Creek Court reported that she was assaulted by a man who broke into her residence. A 15-year-old living in the Village of Carvers Falls was assaulted in her home by an intruder that entered the window while she was home alone. Her bedsheets had cartoon characters on it, but even that didn't deter him. She later dropped out of high school, became involved in an abusive relationship, and began to self-harm because she hated her body for not fighting hard enough against her attacker. By her early 20s, she no longer wanted to live. But now at the age of 30, She's happily married and on the dean's list at college. A 21-year-old student at Methodist University, living in the Heather Ridge apartments on Ramsey Street between Kenlaw and Carver's Fall Roads, reported being assaulted by a man who broke into her apartment. Her two friends were asleep in another room and he told her if she wasn't quiet, they would get it too. He asked her too what she'd be doing later. Because there were roommates, Bowden led her out of the sliding glass doors and into a field where he sexually assaulted her. He assaulted her again on her patio before telling her to go back inside and lay on the couch. He warned her he would know if she didn't because he could see her through the sliding glass doors. Before leaving, he took her keys, cell phone, and purse. Then in January 2008, a 29-year-old woman said she was sexually assaulted by a man who broke into her home in the Kings Grant condominiums while her husband was on a military deployment. There was no DNA, but the suspect had the same MO. Bowden is also accused of stealing property from some of the women. He attended Pine Forest High School and grew up in the Linden area. In 1993, at the age of 19, Bowden was sentenced to 8 years in prison for breaking into vehicles and larceny. He was given a suspended sentence but violated his probation and was incarcerated. He only spent 6 months in prison where he earned his GED and a swastika tattoo. Since 1992, Bowden has been charged with numerous offenses, but nearly all of them were dismissed. In 2009, he was charged with a peeping Tom offense before the General Assembly enacted a law requiring DNA samples to be taken from those arrested on certain charges. In 2014, he was in court for a felony but not convicted, so no DNA was collected. Records show more than 70 criminal filings against him since his 1998 release from prison. At the time of his arrest, Bowden was living at the 500 block of Palestine Road in Linden, was a father of 6 and working in the heating and air conditioning business. He took a plea deal and pleaded guilty to 24 charges of rape, 6 counts of first-degree kidnapping, 5 counts of first-degree burglary, 2 counts of larceny, 2 counts of possession of stolen goods, first-degree statutory rape, and indecent liberties with a child. In exchange for the plea, redundant charges were dismissed. His friends and parents stated that they were shocked and don't believe he is capable of committing these crimes. He took a plea deal on February 11, 2022 and will spend at least 22 years in prison and a maximum of 29, with credit for time served since his arrest in August 2018. Judge Ammons denied Bowden's request that he be considered for work release and said that he would even request that Bowden not be a candidate for early release and ordered the women's testimony be transcribed to share it with any parole board. 5 of the 6 women were present on the first row in court to see this horrible person's sentence. Police are asking anyone who believes they may have been a victim or who knows someone they believe to have been a victim of Bowden's to come forward and talk with detectives. Crystal Faye Todd was born on January 4, 1974 in Conway, South Carolina to parents Junior and Bonnie Todd. At the age of 17, she was a senior at a Conway, South Carolina high school, and as an early graduation gift, her mother Bonnie Faye Todd had given her a brand new 1991 Toyota Celica. On November 17, 1991, Crystal stopped in for her grandmother's birthday celebration and left about 7 p.m. kissing her mother goodbye and saying she was headed to the mall to meet her friends. Around 9 p.m. Crystal and a friend decided to go to a party in the Punch Bowl community where they stayed until 11 p.m. After dropping her friend off at home, Crystal rushed back to the mall to say goodbye to friends before her midnight curfew. But she never arrived home that night, and when midnight came and went, her mother became very concerned. At 3 a.m., Bonnie phoned police and a dispatcher took her description along with the description of her car. He tried to reassure her it wasn't unusual for teens to show up late and that Bonnie should just let him know when her daughter got home. At 8 a.m., Bonnie was panicking and called 911. Next, she contacted her daughter's longtime close friend, Ken Register, who said that he hadn't seen Crystal all night and that he would check the local hospitals. 2 of Crystal's friends had found her car parked at the Conway Middle School. An officer was dispatched to the location and found the car locked with Crystal's purse still inside. The officer tried to reassure her that Crystal was likely still out with friends and having too much fun to call or come home. But Bonnie knew that wasn't like Crystal, and she said she knew her daughter wasn't coming home. The next day, on November 18, 1991, 2 men were driving just outside of Conway in the Maple community when one of them noticed something odd lying in the ditch along the road. Getting out for a closer inspection, the men realized it was a female body. The scene was gruesome, and she was found to have been sexually assaulted. Her mother, a widow, was inconsolable. She told police that she was certain that Crystal's killer was someone she knew. Investigators believed the same thing, especially when they learned that she would have never gotten into a vehicle with someone she didn't know. Criminal profilers predicted that the killer would be an angry young white male who was confident the law wouldn't catch him, and he was probably a friend of the victim. Police asked 51 of Crystal's male friends and acquaintances if they would give DNA samples, and they all agreed. Crystal's friends, including longtime friend Ken Register, were there for Bonnie through the entire ordeal. Ken and Crystal had grown up together and remained close friends, and even Bonnie had always been fond of him. He was a shoulder for Bonnie to cry on and someone to rant to. However, before she was murdered, the friendship between Crystal and Ken had taken a turn for the worse. Crystal had confided in Bonnie that Ken had propositioned her for sex, despite the fact that he had a girlfriend and she had been appalled by this. The two had dated briefly in their early teens, but then decided to return to being close friends again. There had also been serious warning signs about Ken in the previous years. When he was 15, he made an obscene phone call to a grown woman and described in sickening detail how he wanted to mutilate and kill her. When it was his turn to be interviewed by police, he hesitantly but willingly provided his DNA, but the lab was backlogged, and it would be a couple months before they got to all the DNA samples collected from the citizens. Then, on February 15, 1992, the lab notified the police that they had a DNA match. Ken Register eventually broke down and confessed to the crime. He told investigators a story that is very likely untrue. He told them on the night Crystal died, they had unprotected consensual sex. Ken said when he didn't use protection, Crystal became furious and threatened to cry rape if she became pregnant. Said he became outraged at Crystal's screaming and insults, and before he realized what he was doing, he was stabbing her. Ken told investigators when he came to his senses and realized what he'd done, he panicked. He pulled Crystal from his car, tossed her into the ditch, threw away the knife, and hurried home. Crystal's car keys and other evidence was found located at the Register home. Bonnie was shocked that she had been duped by Ken, who even served as a pallbearer at her daughter's funeral. After Register's arrest, it was discovered he had been arrested in September 1991 for exposing himself to a couple of teenage girls after asking them for directions. The charges were still pending when he was arrested for Crystal's murder. In September 1992, Register was tried on the indecent exposure charges and quickly found guilty. Then in early 1993, jurors found him guilty for Crystal's death, his sexual misconduct, kidnapping, and torture. Ken Register was sentenced to life in prison and remains incarcerated at the Broad River Prison in Columbia, South Carolina. There are reportedly many friends and family members of Crystal's who continue to write to and attend parole hearings. Anytime he is eligible. Despite being sentenced to 2 life sentences, he was eligible for parole in February 2022, but he waived his right to face the parole board. Nearly 2,700 people signed a petition asking that his parole not be granted. He will be eligible to face the parole board again in 2024. Her mother Bonnie passed away in 2014 and is buried next to her daughter in Conway. Yanira Cedias was born on March 3, 1992, and by the age of 30, she was a mother of 3 young children and described as vibrant and lively with a big smile. On March 4, 2022, Yanira was celebrating her 30th birthday at a local casino. After the celebration, her ex-boyfriend, Juan Gastelum, picked her up and took her back to his apartment. This was the last time she was ever seen alive. After going missing, Moses Lake police called Yanira's phone to see if someone would answer. A man believed to be her ex, Gastelum, answered the phone. This information led police to question Gastelum. Allegedly, after they arrived at his apartment, Gastelum murdered Yanira and then took photos of himself sexually assaulting her. He then left the apartment with her body. Her family, with help of volunteers and community members, started searching several locations for Yanira's remains. Over 2 months later, on May 12th, detectives received data from Gastelum's cell phone leading them to where he went after leaving the apartment that night, which was a remote area off Highway 12 just outside Wauhula Junction, Washington. When authorities arrived at the location, they found her body in a sleeping bag covered with tree limbs and leaves. At this time, the medical examiner has not released the details on how Yanira died. However, Moses Lake police say that they found a large hunting knife that Gastelum threw away at a gas station and cadaver dogs detected human blood on it. He was arrested days later in Oregon, but fought extradition for 2 months before finally being extradited back to Washington state. He was charged with second-degree murder and second-degree rape following disturbing photos found on his cell phone. Documents also say Gastelum admitted to being physically abusive to Yanira, as 2 physical domestic calls were referenced from October 2021 and January 2022. On October 4, 2021, Yanira even requested a police report to get a restraining order against Gastelum. Gastelum had pleaded not guilty to both charges, and his next court appearance is scheduled for July 5, 2022. Yanira's 3 young children now live with their grandmother, Yanira's mother, Anna, and they deeply miss their mommy. On January 4, 1996, a woman called 911 and reported that a black man had broken into her apartment located at 2205 North Broadway Street in Santa Ana, California, and was stabbing her boyfriend. When police arrived, they found 22-year-old Christopher Hervey with multiple stab wounds. Tragically, Christopher would later die from his injuries. His girlfriend, Jade Binning, who he shared the apartment with, would tell police that she woke up at 3 a.m. to find Christopher struggling with the intruder. She said she tried to help but was slashed in the hand. Investigators would also speak with the neighbors who told police they'd heard a loud argument inside the apartment before police arrived. Detectives for this case told reporters at the time that it seemed like it was an attempted burglary gone wrong and nobody was arrested. The case went cold until January 2020, when investigators received an anonymous letter implicating Jade Binning for the murder of Christopher Hervey. After reopening the case, investigators found forensic evidence linking her to the crime. So on May 3, 2022, 26 years after his death, Binning, now a mother of 3, was arrested by the Marshals Lone Star Fugitive Task Force near her home in Austin, Texas, and charged with his murder. In 1986, Michelle Welch was 12 years old and lived in Tacoma, Washington. On March 26, 1986, a babysitter allowed Michelle and her 2 younger sisters to ride their bikes to the nearby Puget Park in Tacoma. When they arrived, they realized they left their lunches, so Michelle rode her bike back home and then returned with their lunches. When she returned, she chained her bike next to one of her sister's bikes, set the lunches on the table, and went looking for her siblings, who had gone to a nearby business to use the restroom because there wasn't any at the park. When Michelle's sisters returned to the park, they didn't see her, so they went and played near a cave under the bridge for another half an hour. When the sisters returned to the park, they found a brown paper bag with their lunches on the table, but still no Michelle. They called her name and started down a trail looking for her, before their babysitter summoned them back. It was then determined that Michelle was missing. A classmate later told detectives that he saw a man in the park that day under the Proctor Bridge who kept watching the girls. Police were called to the park and began searching with a tracking dog. That night before midnight, the dog found her body in a makeshift fire pit area in the gulch. She had been beaten and sexually assaulted and died from a cut to the neck. DNA was collected and preserved, but unfortunately, there were no matches in the Cody's database. Parents of children in Tacoma would no longer allow their kids to ride their bikes or venture out as they had always done. Her murder would go unsolved for the next 30 years. In 2018, Parabon Nanolabs uploaded the suspect's DNA to GEDmatch, a public genetic genealogy database which permits searches of this type. Genetic genealogists then began building an in-depth family tree, narrowing the suspect to one of 2 brothers, Gary Charles Hartman. Both brothers had lived in Tacoma, Washington, when Michelle was murdered. The pair was placed under police surveillance, and officers eventually followed Gary Hartman into a restaurant, where they obtained a napkin he had used and discarded. Lo and behold, the DNA matched the DNA from the crime scene. 70-year-old Gary Hartman was charged with her rape and murder and sentenced to more than 26 years in prison. At his sentencing, he told his own family that he was sorry. According to reports, Hartman was working as a community nurse specialist at Western State Hospital and had a clean criminal record. However, Michelle wasn't the only young girl murdered in Tacoma in 1986. Within months of her murder, 13-year-old Jennifer Bastian was also murdered. It was always believed that their killers were likely the same person as their slayings were very similar and both had been innocently riding their bikes through the city parks. But in 2016, Paramount Nanolabs created a snapshot phenotype report to the task force, which showed that although both men were Caucasian, the suspect in Michelle's case had 9% Northern Native American admixture and Jennifer's killer did not, meaning they were not the same person. Jennifer's killer, 66-year-old Robert Washburn, was also caught using information provided to investigators by genetic genealogists. Just like Hartman, Washburn was caught after a paper napkin was collected that he had been using at a restaurant, allowing them to collect his DNA. The DNA from the napkin matched the DNA that was collected from the crime scene in 1986. These two innocent girls' murders prompted a new bill called Jennifer and Michelle's Law. Signed into law in 2019 by Governor Jay Inslee, the bill sought to expand law enforcement's DNA database and allows detectives to obtain DNA samples from deceased sex offenders. The morning of December 7, 1985 in Frenchville, Maine, Armand and Lorraine Pelletier's Siberian Husky was led outside to relieve himself in the freezing temperatures and returned ever so gently holding a deceased newborn baby. Shocked, the couple took the baby in and called police. It was discovered that a woman gave birth just 700 feet from the home. She then left the infant in the snow and below zero temperatures. Upon leaving, she left tie prints in the snow. Police told them the newborn baby may have lived up to 30 minutes in the 30 below temperatures. The couple was never able to have children of their own and said had the baby survived, they would have loved to adopt her. Nearly 37 years later, on June 13th, in Maine State Police detectives traveled to Lowell, Massachusetts to arrest the mother of baby Jane Doe. Using genetic genealogy, DNA, and many years of hard work, the suspect was finally identified. The mother was identified as 58-year-old Leanne Daigle, formerly Leanne Garrett of Lowell, Massachusetts. She was quickly charged with the infant's murder, but has pleaded not guilty. At the age of 21, Daigle reportedly drove to a gravel pit in Frenchfield and gave birth to a baby girl. She alleges that she had no clue that she was pregnant, and on the night of December 6, 1985, she was driving home from work when she had the sudden urge to urinate. She pulled to the side of the road and gave birth and believed the infant was stillborn and left, blocking out what had just occurred. A couple weeks later, she and her new boyfriend moved in together in New Hampshire, where he was offered a new job. They had met at a July 4th celebration 5 months before she gave birth. They later married in 1987 and had 2 daughters and was reportedly a good mom to her daughters. The same technique used to find Leanne was used to find the biological father of the baby. He is now in an assisted living facility in Florida and unable to speak or communicate. One of Leanne's daughters had an in-depth conversation with her mother after she was arrested. Daigle said she had blocked out the memory and didn't recall anything about it until the police showed up to her door telling her she was the mother of an infant found dead decades earlier. It was determined she likely became pregnant on her 21st birthday but does not remember what happened the night of her birthday and did not recognize the name of the baby's father. She stated she suspects that she was drugged and raped. Her new boyfriend, who would later become her husband, stated if he had known she was pregnant at the time they started dating, that he would have wanted her to keep the baby and have them raise it together. He said that if she knew about the pregnancy, she may have hid it out of fear that he would leave her. At first, detectives did not believe that Daigle could have given birth without help and suspected John Daigle, her then-boyfriend of several months, had assisted her. John said he produced a college transcript showing that he was in Orano in early December finishing school, and a roommate from the time sent police an email backing up his alibi. This will definitely be a case to continue to watch. Jody Loomis was born June 5, 1952, and at the age of 20, she was living in Bethel, Washington at 20 Winesap Road. On August 23, 1972, She was innocently riding her bicycle from her home to a stable on Strumy Road to visit and ride her horse, Saudi, which was several miles away. She was last seen alive riding north on North Road to 164th Street Southeast by a girl working at a fruit stand. That girl saw her crossing the Bethel Everett Highway and riding up the hill on what was then called Penny Creek Road at about 5 p.m. About 30 minutes later, a couple who was driving up a secluded dirt road to Penny Creek Road, which is now Mill Creek Road, found Jody's partially nude body. She was still alive, but had been tragically shot twice and sexually assaulted. They placed her into their sob sonnet and was sadly pronounced dead on arrival to the hospital. It was determined that she had likely been shot with a .22 caliber weapon. Also, the bridle of her horse was missing from the crime scene and her bicycle had been thrown down a steep embankment. Her murder would go unsolved for the next 46 years. In 2008, a state crime lab technician discovered a tiny semen stain on Jody's boot that had previously gone unnoticed. This DNA would be used years later to begin a new investigation using genetic genealogy performed by Parbon Nanolabs and genetic genealogist Deb Stone. After the genealogist identified the parents of a possible suspect based on the family tree, police began to follow him. They would acquire a DNA sample from a discarded coffee cup he tossed in the trash while at the Tula Lip Resort Casino. Washington State Patrol's crime lab confirmed that it positively matched the DNA profile from the crime scene and indeed belonged to 77-year-old Terrence Miller of Edmonds, Washington. In April 2019, Miller was arrested at his home by detectives with the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office and charged with her murder. Miller had a history of sex crimes dating back to the 1960s, including molesting young girls and indecent exposure. After he was let out on bond, he was found dead, presumably from suicide, while the jurors were deliberating. 3 hours after his death, a jury convicted him of first-degree murder. Jody's brother, John Loomis, said he would have at least liked to see Miller go to prison after getting away with it for 48 long years. At the age of 30, Sherry Renee Herrera was a mother of 4 children living in Tulare, California. On March 30, 1993, Sherry had been dropped off at a rest area between Tulare and Pixley, California, and had arranged to be picked up in 10 minutes. This would be the last time she was seen alive. Just a few days later, her body was found in the desert along the I-10 freeway in Riverside County, California. DNA was collected from her body in the crime scene, and she had been sexually assaulted and strangled. Court records identify her as a non-prostitute and drug user who worked the highway rest area in Tulare, California. With no leads, her case would go cold for the next 3 decades. In late May of 2022, Texas Rangers arrested 67-year-old Douglas Thomas at his home in Waco, Texas, for the murder of Shinda Denise Hayes. Shinda had been found murdered in Titus County, Texas in April of 1992, and just like Sherry, Shinda was also a known prostitute. Thomas was connected by authorities to that murder by a DNA match to evidence obtained from the crime scene. Thomas had traveled extensively throughout the United States during his 40-plus years as a truck driver. Using genetic genealogy, a family tree was created which led them to recently retired Thomas likely being responsible for Sherry's death as well. Investigators traveled to Texas and interviewed Thomas about Sherry's homicide. His DNA was collected to verify that he was indeed the suspect they were looking for. Based on their investigation, he was charged with her rape and murder. Thomas remains in custody in Texas and will be prosecuted first for the 1992 murder of Shinda. The DA's office will then request extradition to California to face justice for the murder of Sherry. It is believed that Thomas is a serial killer with more victims during his decades working as a long-haul truck driver. On July 9, 1997, Bailey Troy Gardner was born in Lenexa, Kansas, just outside Kansas City. At 27, he was living in Hendersonville, Tennessee, working as a technical program manager at Amazon. Friends and family said he had a heart of gold. He loved being on the water with his boat and was especially close to his dad, Troy. Late Friday night into early Saturday, June 29, 2024, at Cedar Creek Marina, on Old Hickory Lake in Mount Juliet, just outside Nashville, a horrible tragedy unfolded. Just after midnight, the marina's restaurant, the Scoreboard, had closed for the night. Around that same time, 3 masked suspects ambushed employees inside, pistol-whipped 2 of them, and forced them to open the safe. As they fled, Bailey pulled into the parking lot with his boat in tow. One suspect approached the driver's side of his truck and opened fire, shooting Bailey multiple times while he was still in the vehicle. The employees who were assaulted survived, but Bailey was pronounced dead at the scene. Investigators worked quickly using Mount Juliet cameras. The tag came back to 41-year-old Adrian A. McLean of Nashville. 3 weeks after the shooting, on July 17, 2024, McLean was arrested and charged with first-degree murder and 3 counts of aggravated robbery. Authorities also noted he had overstayed his visa. 2 accomplices remain at large. 14 months later, in mid-September 2025, a Wilson County jury convicted McLean of first-degree murder and aggravated robbery. Under Tennessee law, the conviction carries a mandatory life sentence. Formal sentencing is currently set for January 9, 2026. Investigators are still seeking the other suspects and are offering a $15,000 reward for information leading to their arrest. Caitlin Jordan Crocker was born May 18, 1999 in Columbia, South Carolina to Harold and Jonna Crocker. At 19, she was living in Winesboro, fun, a little stubborn in the best way, and dreaming big. She graduated Fairfield Central with honors in 2017, earned her cosmetology license, and landed a beauty expert job at the Ulta in Sand Hills. She wanted to do makeup for celebrities one day, but would sadly never get the chance. As for her love life, she was in an on-again, off-again relationship with Alexander Harmon and sometimes stayed at his place in Camden. That's where she was the night of June 2, 2018. Deputies were sent to Harmon's home on Cleveland School Road after his father, calling from New York, told 911 that his son said he'd shot Caitlin and planned to take his own life. When officers arrived, they found Caitlin inside, dead from a gunshot wound to the head. They recovered a 12-gauge shotgun and a spent shell. On body cam, Harmon admitted the shooting and was arrested. Investigators have not publicly offered a specific motive. No robbery, no intruder, just a deadly act inside a troubled relationship. Harmon was booked in 2018 and initially released on a $150,000 surety bond. He missed a court date on November 17, 2023, and a warrant was issued. After more than a year on the run, U.S. Marshals arrested him in Iowa in January 2025, and he was extradited to Kershaw County. On September 19, 2025, the jury found Alexander Harmon guilty of Caitlin's murder. He was sentenced to life in prison.